All right, welcome in, everyone. I know our listeners love a good philosophy deep dive. So today we're taking a look at utilitarianism.
Yeah, utilitarianism should be a fun one.
Now, at its simplest, utilitarianism is the idea that the right action is the one that leads to the best outcome overall, like the most good.
And importantly, that puts it squarely in the consequentialist camp. So it's all about the consequences of actions, not some inherent rightness or wrongness.
Exactly. No good or bad actions in themselves, just good or bad outcomes.
Right.
And to guide us through this, we'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the history of utilitarianism.
Great source.
Yeah, it gives us a really thorough look at how this idea developed over time. So for this deep dive, we'll be looking at the core tenets of utilitarianism, how it evolved historically, and of course, some of the really interesting philosophical debates around it. I think our listeners will find it fascinating.
Definitely.
So let's get right into it. Where can we trace the earliest forms of utilitarianism?
Well, even though utilitarianism was really formalized in the 19th century, the basic idea that morality is about increasing happiness and well-being, that goes way back. Like we see it in the British moralists.
The British moralists, for someone just starting to learn about this, who are we talking about here?
We're talking about people like Cumberland, Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, Gay, and Hume. They were wrestling with big questions about morality, questions that set the stage for utilitarianism.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. Take Cumberland and Gay. They put forward this idea of, and I'm using the term a little loosely here, theological utilitarianism.
Theological utilitarianism, what does that even mean?
So basically, they thought that we have this duty to promote human happiness because that's what God wants. And Gay took it even further. He said that we can only have a true obligation to do something if it comes from God. Because only God can give us true happiness or make us totally miserable. So he argued that our duty to be virtuous, that comes directly from God's will.
So virtue comes from God, but where does happiness come in?
Well, Gay also said that since God wants us to be happy, human happiness becomes a kind of secondary measure of virtue. So God says be virtuous. God wants us to be happy. Therefore, if we make people happy, we're following God's will.
Interesting. So it's like there's this chain. God's will leads to virtue, which in turn leads to human happiness.
Yeah, exactly.
But wouldn't that make you think, well, maybe we can just focus on happiness directly and cut out God?
Yeah, and that's kind of the tricky part with theological utilitarianism. It isn't necessarily incompatible with utilitarianism, but it also isn't required. I mean, utilitarianism can stand on its own, right?
Yeah.
The focus is on the consequences for human well-being, and that can be a moral basis all by itself.
Okay, I see. So we can have a morality focused on well-being without bringing God into the picture.
Right.
Now, you mentioned Gay influenced Hume.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, Gay looked at how we come to approve or disapprove of actions and traits. He thought we link certain things with their effects, and that creates positive or negative associations, which ultimately become our moral judgments. Now, Gay thought this whole valuing of happiness came from God, but Hume, he took a more natural view. He rejected the God part and leaned towards our natural human sympathies. And that view actually has roots in Shaftesbury's work.
Ah, yes, Shaftesbury. What was his big contribution to all of this?
He was all about the moral sense, this idea that we have this inner ability to just see right and wrong, kind of like how we see beauty and ugliness. Right. No need to reason it out, we just sense it.
Wow, so we're just born with a sense of morality. That's a big claim.
It is. And Hume liked that core idea of innate moral sense, but was a bit skeptical about it being some objective truth out there. Like he compared it to how we see color. In philosophy today, we call those secondary qualities. They depend on our perception, not on some inherent property of the thing itself. So for Hume, if we call something vicious, it isn't because it's inherently vicious. It's because of how we react to it emotionally, because of its effects.
Okay, I see. So morality is tied to our subjective experiences, not some independent moral truth.
Right. But Shaftesbury also had this important idea that doing good for others is good for you, which Hume then developed further, especially in his work on social utility.
Okay, so that kind of bridges the gap between individual well-being and the well-being of others.
Exactly. Now, with Shaftesbury, sometimes it's hard to separate out the egoism from the utilitarianism. He said, looking out for everyone's good is ultimately in your self-interest. So it's like individual and collective well-being become one.
So, is it self-interest with the good of others as a side effect, or genuine concern for everyone with personal benefit as a side effect? That's a pretty big difference philosophically.
For sure. If it's all about me, then that's egoism. But if it's about everyone else, even if it happens to benefit me, That's more in line with utilitarianism.
Hmm.
And one more thing about Shaftesbury. He believed that to make moral judgments, you need to be able to think about things, reflect. You need to be able to look at someone's character and decide if it's good or bad. So he said animals can't really be judged morally because they don't have that kind of thinking.
That's interesting. So according to him, no matter how good an animal seems to behave, it's not actually subject to moral judgment.
Right. And for him, it wasn't just about the actions, but also the reasons behind them, like your affections, your motives, your overall character. Even if you accidentally hurt someone, you wouldn't be bad if you meant well.
Makes sense. So judging someone morally is about more than just the outcome. It's about intention, too.
Exactly. Now let's talk about Francis Hutcheson. You called him explicitly utilitarian, right?
Yes, I believe I did.
He built on that moral sense idea, but also talked about how we choose what to do. In his book, he basically laid out a utilitarian principle, saying the best action is the one that creates the most happiness for the most people. But he also said that sometimes the importance of a person might outweigh sheer numbers.
Ah, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The classic utilitarian phrase. So Hutchison was key in actually putting that into words. But you mentioned a tension between moral sense and reason in his work.
Yeah, some people think there's a conflict between directly feeling morality through the moral sense and actually reasoning about the best action. But scholars like Jeffrey Scar point out that these two things can work together. Like the moral sense guides you towards good actions, and then you use reason to figure out the specifics to rank different choices by their likely outcomes.
Okay, so moral sense points us in the right direction, and then reason helps us fine-tune our actions.
Yeah, one way to look at it. And Stephen Darwall adds that for Hutcheson, the moral sense is mostly about judging motives. Like we naturally like good intentions. But if you really want to do good, you need to use reason to figure out how to actually achieve that good. And while Hutcheson believed in maximizing good, he did have that caveat about a person's worth potentially overriding mere numbers, like a hint of deontology sneaking into his utilitarianism.
I see. So maximizing good, but with respect for individual worth.
Right. And finally, we can't forget David Hume, a student of Hutcheson. He was massively influenced by both Hutcheson and Shaftesbury. His ideas about social utility had a big impact on Bentham, and his focus on feelings and moral judgments, that was a precursor to Mill. And this is where we start to see things diverge. Mill goes on to develop what some call an altruistic approach, though whether that label is accurate is debated, while Bentham leans towards a more egoistic view of human nature, kind of like Hobbes.
So we see these early thinkers laying the groundwork for utilitarianism, each with their own unique take on it. Now let's move on to the big names. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. They're considered the founders of classical utilitarianism. What was driving their work?
Both were passionate about social and legal reform. They saw a lot of problems in the system, laws that didn't work, customs that caused harm. They wanted a solid ethical framework to judge existing practices and argue for change. They needed a clear standard to decide if an action or law was morally right.
So it was more than just an academic exercise. They wanted to actually improve society with their philosophy.
Absolutely. Their work on utilitarianism was all about fixing the injustices and problems they saw around them. Bentham, for example, thought the problem with a lot of laws and practices was their lack of utility. They just caused pain without any benefit. For him, if something didn't clearly lead to good, it wasn't morally justified.
A very practical perspective. So what were the main points of Bentham's utilitarianism?
Bentham's famous for saying that we're ruled by two things, pleasure and pain. We seek one, avoid the other. That's it. And from that, he developed the principle of utility. Actions are good if they lead to happiness or pleasure, bad if they lead to unhappiness or pain. Simple as that. This applies to individuals and governments.
But you mentioned tension with psychological egoism earlier. How did Bentham reconcile our drive for pleasure with the need to promote the good of all, even when it clashes with our own self-interest?
Yeah, that was a tricky one. He tried to say that in the long run, doing good for everyone would benefit you too. But that doesn't really solve the basic problem that psychological egoism is all about self-interest, which goes against the whole idea of impartial, selfless utilitarianism. Though, to be fair, later on, Bentham softened his stance on pure egoism and admitted that people can also be driven by genuine care for others.
So he acknowledged that there's more to human motivation than just seeking pleasure for ourselves.
Exactly.
How is Bentham's take on moral judgment different from Hume's?
Well, Hume was mostly concerned with judging character, seeing actions as clues to a person's inner traits. Bentham switched the focus to judging actions based on their outcomes. And this shift from judging character to judging actions, it gained traction after Hume. And it fits well with the purpose of law. You make laws to control what people do, not to control their thoughts or intentions, which are much harder to judge or influence with laws. Okay, so Bentham cared about what you did, not necessarily why you did it. That's right. And he took Hume's idea of utility as a measure of virtue and broadened it. For Hume, social utility was about the concrete benefits a trait had for society, which might not directly make people happy. But Bentham, he shifted to seeing pleasure as the ultimate goal, the real good that makes actions right or wrong. And this move actually addressed a weakness in Hume. You see, if it's all about our subjective feelings that decide whether something is a virtue or a vice, then how do we deal with biases and errors in those judgments? With Bentham, an action's right if it leads to good outcomes, regardless of whether people see those outcomes correctly or react to them appropriately.
So it introduced a kind of objectivity, even though it's still rooted in our subjective experiences of pleasure and pain.
Right. And Bentham was famous for saying that you can't just dislike something and use that as a reason to make it illegal. He used homosexuality as an example. Just because some people find it distasteful, that doesn't make it wrong or justify banning it. He was a true hedonist. Pleasure was the only real good, pain the only real bad.
And that's where his philosophic calculus comes in, right? His system for measuring pleasure and pain.
Exactly. He had all these factors you had to consider. Intensity, duration, certainty, how soon it happens, how likely it is to lead to more of the same feeling, how pure it is, meaning is it met with any pain, and how many people it affects.
Sounds pretty complex, almost like a scientific formula for making moral decisions. Did he expect us to use this for every little choice?
Not really for every single decision, no. He knew that would be too much. It was more of a framework to help us come up with general moral principles and to judge how good laws and policies are. He said we often use rules of thumb based on what we've learned, which usually work out well for overall happiness. But he also said that sometimes it's okay to break those rules if doing so will clearly lead to a much better outcome.
So rules are more like guidelines for maximizing happiness, not absolute commands.
Yeah. And Bentham's idea that the morality of an action depends on its consequences, that was radical at the time. He didn't believe that any action was inherently wrong no matter what. This had big implications for how he saw laws and social policy. He thought laws should always be checked and updated based on whether they actually make people happier.
Constantly adapting to maximize well-being. Makes sense.
It does.
So we've covered Bentham's foundation. Now, John Stuart Mill, he was a follower of Bentham, but also had his own ideas, especially about what happiness is and how we should think about it.
Yeah, Mill had a lot of respect for Bentham, but he felt that Bentham's focus on just the quantity of pleasure was too simplistic. It missed out on the different types of experiences that contribute to human flourishing. Mill argued for a qualitative difference between pleasures. He thought intellectual, moral, and aesthetic pleasures were just better, higher kinds of pleasure than simple physical or animalistic ones.
So it wasn't just about how much pleasure you get, but the quality of that pleasure.
Exactly. Now, someone could argue that Bentham's system, with its emphasis on things like the long-term consequences of pleasure and its purity, might indirectly support some of Mill's ideas. But Mill's distinction directly challenges what's called the happy oyster problem. The idea that a simple creature just experiencing constant basic pleasure might be considered better off than a complex human with all their potential for suffering, if you're just looking at the amount of pleasure.
So it wasn't enough for Mill to just tally up pleasures. He wanted to weigh their inherent worth. How did he justify that?
He said, just look at people who've experienced both kinds of pleasure. They always prefer the higher ones, even if those higher pleasures sometimes come with more dissatisfaction. He famously said, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. He was basically saying that utilitarianism can account for why we value things like intellectual pursuits, even if they don't always feel good.
Okay, so quality over quantity when it comes to happiness. What about his attempt to prove the principle of utility, to prove that happiness is what we should aim for?
Mill argued that the only way we know something is visible is because people actually see it. So similarly, the only way we know something is desirable is because people actually desire it. And since people clearly desire happiness, that means happiness is desirable, and it's the ultimate goal of utilitarianism.
But that's where G.E. Moore raised his famous naturalistic fallacy argument, right?
Right. Moore said Mill was making a big mistake by saying that desirable simply means able to be desired. Just because we can desire something, that doesn't automatically mean we should desire it or that it's actually good. Moore insisted that desirable in a moral sense means what is worthy of being desired. And you can't just get that from observing what people happen to want.
That gets at the difference between what is and what ought to be.
Exactly.
Now, Mel also talked a lot about internal sanctions like guilt and remorse. How do those fit in with utilitarianism?
Well, Mill saw humans as social creatures, naturally caring about others, not just focused on themselves. And these internal sanctions, the bad feelings we get when we hurt others or do wrong, they act like internal checks, keeping our actions in line with the greater good. Just like external punishments or social disapproval, they're useful in making sure people act in ways that benefit everyone. And Mill went further. He thought our basic psychology, things like conscience and a sense of justice, were actually the foundation for our desire to do good. He even analyzed where the sense of justice comes from, our natural instinct for self-defense, combined with our ability to sympathize with others. And these, when guided by reason and a concern for the community, form the basis for moral principles.
So these moral feelings are not arbitrary. They're rooted in our nature as social beings and ultimately serve the greater good.
That's right. And Mill, just like Bentham, used utilitarian principles to argue for social changes, like women's rights and free speech. He thought these rights are ultimately justified by how much they contribute to everyone's happiness and well-being. For example, he believed that giving women more rights and opportunities would benefit everyone by bringing in more talent and creating a fairer society. He even imagined the ideal marriage as a true partnership between two educated people, equals in every way.
So rights aren't inherent or God-given, but rather tools for maximizing overall happiness.
That was his view. And both Bentham and Mill really challenged the idea of clinging to traditions and hierarchies just because they're natural. They argue that the only real test should be, does it actually benefit people? Many traditions, they argued, were outdated and even harmful.
Traditions should be judged by their results, not their age.
Exactly. And a common criticism of utilitarianism is that it doesn't seem to value virtue as something good in itself. Like if all that matters are the consequences, what about a person's character? Does utilitarianism just see virtue as a tool to get good results?
That's a valid concern. If all we care about are outcomes, do personal qualities like virtue get overlooked?
Mill addressed this directly in his book. He said that virtue is not just something we want because it leads to happiness, it's also something we can want for its own sake. He argued that someone who doesn't value virtue for itself is lacking something, is less able to promote happiness in general. So for Mill, virtue becomes part of the good life, necessary for true well-being. But Wendy Donner, a philosopher, pointed out that this might clash with some of Mill's other writings, where he seems to link virtue more with aesthetics and morality with duty. And Donner suggests this might be Mill trying to deal with the problem of utilitarianism being too demanding. Like always having to sacrifice for the greater good might be too much for people. So by separating duties, which are absolutely required, from virtuous actions, which are good but maybe not strictly required all the time, Mill was trying to make his ethics more realistic, more livable.
So Mill was trying to refine Bentham's framework, making it more nuanced and workable for real life.
Exactly. Now let's talk about Henry Sidgwick. He wrote a very influential book called The Methods of Ethics, where he compares utilitarianism to other major ethical theories like egoism and intuitionism. What was his main contribution?
I seem to remember he really wanted to analyze different ethical approaches and how we use them in our everyday moral reasoning.
That's right. And although there's still debate about whether he fully endorsed utilitarianism in that book, he certainly argued for its importance in ethical decision-making. He said utilitarianism can be used to resolve conflicts between different moral intuitions or seemingly absolute moral rules. When you have two strong moral principles clashing, Sidgwick thought we need a more fundamental principle to guide us, and for him, that principle was utility. He also pointed out that many of our common-sense moral rules are actually quite vague and lack a strong theoretical foundation, something that utilitarianism can provide. And when we think about justifiable exceptions to those rules, utilitarianism gives us a reason for those exceptions based on the overall consequences.
So utilitarianism, for Sidgwick, was like the underlying theory that supports and clarifies our other ethical beliefs and intuitions.
That was a central point for him. He saw it as the most coherent and justifiable ethical system. Sidgwick also delved into some deeper issues with utilitarianism that hadn't been fully addressed before. One controversial point was his idea that maybe, in some cases, it's better if people don't know about certain utilitarian conclusions, like the idea that sometimes secrecy or even lying can maximize good. He even suggested that regular morality might need to reject some utilitarian conclusions that should only be understood and used by a select few enlightened individuals.
That's a dangerous idea, isn't it? It sounds like it could lead to manipulation and secrecy.
Definitely sparked those concerns. Bernard Williams was a major critic of this idea, calling it government house utilitarianism. It brought to mind the paternalistic attitude of colonial rulers, thinking they know best and making decisions for everyone else. But the philosopher Julia Driver has a different take. She suggests that maybe Sidgwick wasn't being elitist, but was actually thinking about the practical side of ethical decision-making. Like, should we consider the real-world consequences of sharing certain moral truths, even if, ideally, everyone would act rationally and use them for good? If there's a chance that the truth will be misused and cause harm, maybe it's better to be strategic and withhold it. That's what Sidgwick seemed to be suggesting,
Still, it seems to undermine transparency and trust.
for sure. Sidgwick also pointed out some ambiguities in earlier utilitarianism, specifically the difference between maximizing total happiness and average happiness, especially when talking about population growth. Should we aim for the biggest possible amount of happiness, even if it means more people living with a slightly lower level of happiness each? Or should we try to maximize the average level of happiness, even if it means fewer people overall? Sidgwick himself seemed to favor a hybrid approach, trying to maximize both the number of people and their average happiness. This issue, which Sidgwick clearly articulated, was very influential, especially for later philosophers like Derek Parfit.
So Sidgwick wasn't just defending utilitarianism, he was also pointing out its problems and areas that needed further thought.
Precisely.
Now, on to G.E. Moore and his ideal utilitarianism. He disagreed with the whole pleasure as the only good idea that the classical utilitarians were so attached to.
Yes, Moore totally rejected the idea that pleasure is the only thing good in itself. He argued for a more diverse view of value, saying things like beauty and knowledge are also good, regardless of whether they make us feel good.
Beauty being good in itself, how did he justify that?
He used this thought experiment where he asked you to imagine two worlds, one incredibly beautiful but empty, with no living beings, and the other totally ugly, also empty. And he argued that we naturally say the beautiful world is better, even though there's no one there to experience any pleasure from its beauty. This, he argued, shows that beauty has value all on its own, regardless of its effects on us. This emphasis on objective goodness resonated with the Bloomsbury Group, a group of intellectuals and artists that Moore was part of. It also offered a way to think about those tricky, admirable immorality cases, those thought experiments where doing something seemingly wrong actually leads to something really good, like creating amazing art.
So in Moore's version of utilitarianism, an action could be right even if it doesn't directly cause happiness, as long as it leads to other good things, like beauty.
That's one way to interpret it, though Moore himself didn't fully develop his theory along those lines. Moore also questioned whether pleasure is always good no matter what. He used the example of a universe of sadists who get pleasure from hurting others. He argued that we don't see that pleasure as good because it's tied to bad intentions and harmful actions. So he said it's not just about the pleasure, but also about the absence of bad things, like bad intentions.
That definitely challenges the simple idea that all pleasure is good.
Right. And Moore came up with this concept of organic unity. This means that the value of a whole experience can be different from the sum of the value of its parts. He used this to explain why seeing a beautiful object in real life is better than just seeing an illusion of it, even if the feeling of pleasure is the same in both cases. The real object adds something extra, something valuable that the illusion doesn't have. This organic unity idea also helped ideal utilitarians deal with the issue of happiness based on false beliefs. They could say that this kind of happiness is less valuable than happiness based on truth and genuine understanding.
So Moore's ideal utilitarianism broadened the idea of good beyond just pleasure and pain, offering a more complex and nuanced view of value.
Exactly.
And to wrap things up, while not many philosophers today fully agree with everything Bentham and Mill said, especially their focus on pleasure, their influence on moral and political philosophy, and even how we make public policy has been massive. This focus on consequences and Bentham's simple question, what use is it, are still central to ethical discussions today. A lot of philosophers today identify as consequentialists. They agree that outcomes are important when judging actions, even if they disagree about exactly what kind of good we should be maximizing.
It's true. While the specific tenets of classical utilitarianism might not be widely accepted, its impact is undeniable.
So this deep dive, using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide, has given us a really in-depth look at the development of utilitarianism, from its early roots to its most famous versions, and then the critiques and refinements that followed. It's still a complex and hotly debated area in philosophy.
It is. And all these discussions about its different forms, its strengths, and its challenges, they show just how relevant it remains as a way to think about those big moral questions we all face.
So for our listeners out there, here's something to consider. Given all the different types of utilitarianism and the criticisms we've talked about, what do you think is its biggest strength when facing the complicated ethical problems in the world today? And on the flip side, what's its biggest weakness, the challenge that maybe it can't overcome? Keep thinking about this fundamental theory and how it still applies today. Until next time, keep those minds sharp.
Absolutely. Keep questioning, keep exploring.
That's it for our deep dive on utilitarianism. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.